All right, here we go. We're recording. Boyo redacted alert. We're here with a Greco Boyo. That's what we've got down here. He is a med. I'm surprised he hopefully he's after he's not like in the middle of his siesta or something like that. I might have dragged him out of bed or something like that. But we have a med here, and we're going to communicate with the Irish, the secret meds of the north, and we're going to talk about a German name known as Nietzsche, and we're going to talk about his brilliant book called The Birth of Tragedy. And the reason why we're talking to a Greco Boyo is because he is actually, Greek, and so The Birth of Tragedy was premised on two concepts, not really from Greek mythology, but derivative of Greek mythology, Apollo and Dionysus. And of course, we want to talk to the experts about this stuff. And so this gentleman here, Mike, he had... Well, we'll make one here today. Okay. This gentleman, Mike, he operates a YouTube channel called Ancient Greece Revisited. It's absolutely brilliant. It's one of those ones that you find these channels and you're kind of thinking this is going to be huge. And like it's only got a couple of, is it 100 or 1,000 subs so far? And
we got about 630, I think. So pretty low so far, but hopefully we're going strong.
The quality is absolutely excellent, so I am sure you're going to shoot right up to the stars. I recommend, Boyos, you give him a boost and check that stuff out because I think it's really, really good. He has one particular one that did really well on basically the Greeks taking LSD. So if you want, check that one out, and you'll have a good crack with that. Their own version of that stuff, the mystery cults, perhaps. But today we're going to talk about snotty, nasty, screechy Nietzsche and his Apollyon Dionysian concept. So I'll let, I guess, Mike introduce himself there, and then take it away, sir.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So no, I'm not in siesta. I also lived in Spain, where they don't even have the siesta there. I was frustrated. I even asked on my interview, I had a job there, and I said, do you guys do siesta? And they looked at me like, this is something. But
forgive me for my cultural ignorance.
For the rest. But yeah, I mean, you should stress the fact that you, my friend, you are Mediterranean as well. According to some theorists. Yes. You're the one who got away. I don't know how you ended up there, but something went on. Something went on. Maybe we can discover it in the show. What went on? Why are you up there? Why?
Yes. We've talked about this, and I guess I'm going to tell the Boyos again just to reassert it. Like if you read Irish myth, you get a very complex picture of who the Irish are. You get these blonde, northern, sort of like Scandinavian type characters, like Vikings coming in, who are the people of day, basically the gods, and then these people get replaced by essentially a people called the Milesians, and these are a combination, it seems, or there's various people actually show up in Ireland, but one of them are from Spain. So Hibernia is the old name for Ireland, is related to Iberia, some people claim. I'm not sure if that's a good source, but they do claim Spanish. And then the Milesians themselves, I believe, apparently they were in Greece for a long period of time. And so this is how all this stuff connects. And of course, if you look through Irish mythology, you find a lot of very similar patterns to what you would find in Greek mythology. For example, a pantheon is one. You have a pantheon in Irish myth that is extremely similar to the pantheon in Greek myth, because obviously these are all Indo-Europeans at one point. So yes, sir. So we could have connections. We're building the bonds. I guess the goal is to fundamentally take the English down, just sink that island into the bottom of the sea. So as long as that's the plan, I'm in.
Turn it into Atlantis. Myths will be about a mighty empire that ruled the seas once.
Yeah, that's the purpose of the Irish.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a good pass that you did there, because I know that what you find in Irish mythology, you find in Greek mythology, and you find in many mythologies throughout Europe and the Near East, which is they almost appear to have been built from two separate mythologies merging. Okay, and the idea, the theory, I guess I first encountered it by reading Joseph Campbell back in the day of my youth, and but it goes beyond him, and it links to Nietzsche's understanding of tragedy. But just on the theory itself, the idea is that the archaic world, the Bronze Age world, not Bronze Age as in the Bronze Age mindset, that's Homeric Bronze Age, the Bronze Age, the early Bronze Age, second, third millennia, the cultures that were created through the advent of agriculture. Once the Neolithic settlers settled, the Neolithic hunters and gatherers settled. They created, they began the project of human civilization, through agriculture and obviously, I think Nietzsche had something to say about how some degeneracy went in that as well. But the idea is that the religion that conquered the Fertile Crescent, as it's called, the Tigris, Euphrates rivers, going down into Egypt. So the culture of ancient Egypt is a weird one because they had the Nile, and a lot of their religion was based around the Nile's yearly flooding, so they had like a microclimate there where the Nile would flood, and then it would leave a very fertile soil. But in the other cultures, you have earth worship, perhaps even female-centered cultures. In Europe, the first and the most common are the Minoans of Crete. Okay, so going back to the whole Irish hypothesis, there is an idea that the Minoans might have reached the British Isles. Okay, but whether they did or not, they definitely created a small, for today's standards at least, empire in the Mediterranean, centered on the island of Crete, where in 1900, exactly, Arthur Evans, British archaeologist, rediscovered this civilization, okay? And his idea, he poured in a lot of his own prejudice and a lot of his own ideas into the civilization. He really wanted to turn it into this hippie, like Bronze Age hippie paradise, this ideal world where beautiful men and women played in nature and love versus then war kind of thing. Later his vision was challenged, but ultimately there was something to it. It does seem that before the Indo-Europeans, as you correctly said, came down from the Eurasian plains to the degree that I can understand, there did flourish in Greece for sure, and in the Middle East for sure, and perhaps up to Ireland, a culture whose, cultures plural, whose spiritual center was in the earth, cultures that perhaps prayed not to the sky above, but to the earth below, not Father Sky, Mother Earth. In Crete, the artifacts that Arthur Evans discovered, the most famous is the so-called snake goddess or snake priestess. It's a small figurine of a bare-breasted woman holding a snake in each hand. Okay, and similar images can be found throughout the Middle East. We're talking about, again, 2nd, 3rd, even 4th millennia BC. How much of this is true and whether, a woman sat on the throne is impossible to know. But just judging these aesthetically, which I believe is a very good starting point, to judge a culture almost like it's a work of art, like you would judge a painting in a museum before knowing the history and why it was painted, just holding it in front of you and seeing what comes to you. It is true that, the art that these cultures, these pre-Indo-European, agrarian, archaic, Bronze Age cultures, their aesthetic was very, very different to the aesthetics of the Indo-European cultures, which could mean that their minds were different, the way they saw the world, okay? As the Indo-Europeans, so from that whole world of the goddess, of the mother goddess, let's say, got squeezed from two sides.
Keep going.
Oh, you got the, yes, very good. So you got exactly. So that's a very early image, perhaps, of the great mother goddess. And you see she has two animals, one of each side, which is very typical of
Is this
that.
what Greek chicks look like, man? Is this what they look like?
Yes, you should come and check them out. I'm going to leave you alone in the center of Athens, holding that figurine. See how that goes down.
You, yeah, this is beautiful, and that's a really lucid and interesting point. Is this idea of the idea of judging their art? You can actually, like, it's like Jung's idea of the collective unconscious or something like that, or the collective mind. And looking at the art, you can, it's almost like looking at their dreams, and from that you can actually derive quite a interesting, like, you can read someone's dreams and actually see what they're thinking about. And so why wouldn't you be able to do this with the art? And of course the big thing with these Neolithic cultures is that they have this, as we said, this feminine center. Now, I'd love to talk on that just a little bit for a second. Think about like this rationally, you know, you have this feminine centered religion versus the Indo-European sky religion. So Indo-Europeans basically had chariots. So they would swoop across huge expanses of land. They were pastoralists. They ate meat and drank, you know, kefir, and they didn't really farm. That wasn't their thing. They were steppe riders, like Mongols. Think of it like that. And so the idea there is that the thing that you're following for navigation is the sky. The thing that you're following is the sky. The earth is actually little more than something that you're going to impose your will upon. You don't really need a farm, you know. You don't need to worship the earth. You don't need to understand the earth. You know, the way a woman has periods and she has like a cycle and all that. You don't need to understand any of that stuff. You can just sort of take her at that point. Let's put it this way. And so they would have a whole different upwards, you could say, astral, sky-like way of seeing things, and the whole way that they behaved, swooping across like huge expanses of land, actually really changed the way they would have thought. Like it was essential. You can't think like a farmer and do what those people did. And likewise, the Neolithic people, they couldn't be thinking all the time about how do I like conquer thousands of kilometers of land, because then they would have never actually stayed around long enough to actually sit down and produce something of wealth and beauty. And what, of course, is one of this beautiful woman here. She is the fertile goddess, you know, like full of fat of the land, and obviously loads of mother's milk, these type of things, very fertile, a lot of stuff you can get, and obviously the cultivation of the cow and all that, all these type of things you start to see. So this stuff is actually absolutely fascinating, and it shows a different whole different way of existing, you know, the farmer's lifestyle, the kind of person who's connected to the earth. And yeah, if you want to speak on any of that stuff.
Yeah, you can even pull that snake goddess, that Minoan snake goddess that was discovered in Crete about a century ago. And you know, there you're going to see the culmination. Yeah, lots of it. So
no, she's not too bad, man. She's a good looking chick.
No, so you know, one thing that's very interesting to me is that it shows you how much this Indo-European culture ultimately conquered the minds as well as the bodies. Because you look at her, okay, and you can pull. I see one that's almost like enacted, right? Yeah, we're in the middle down.
Here.
1, 2, 3, 4. 2 to the left.
Here.
Yeah. So, okay, so you see her, right? And you think there's something dark about it.
Yeah.
You know, there's something dark in the way goth music is dark, you know, in the way mystery films, thrillers are dark. You know, they represent the dark principle, the night principle. Okay. But perhaps, you know, this is because we are, at least culturally and linguistically, not going any further, descendants of those Indo-Europeans who saw something dark in that very image that you're holding.
Interesting, yeah.
Yet perhaps for the cultures that created this image, there was something very pure, very divine, you know, pure as in the earth, who's this great mother of inexhaustible fertility. It brings out all kinds of life to nourish her children. And that woman, that young girl there holding the snakes, is her priestess. So what can be more noble, more pure than her, you know? And that could be the mind of the Minoans. We'll never know. But
you know, I'd love to drop in an analogy to help the boyos kind of follow along with this. So Actually, that's a really, really lucid point, is that the Indo-Europeans, as we said, who look up to the sky would have seen this as a dark figure, whereas the people actually who lifted this woman up to her prevalence as, top of the hierarchy, see this as a beautiful goddess. Now, how can you kind of conceptualize this? Well, think a little bit about like the old Christian God, and the way that you would imagine the dudes in the 19th century would have like kind of bopped around and would have been like, God up in the sky, and he's like the conquering God, and he brings the message of Christ all over the world. And it's a very assertive, it's a very, very masculine religion, the way we understand it. And then think of the contrast you have now, basically since the 60s, where you have the rising of this kind of concept of the feminine and the glorious Gaia, the idea. And like, this is not trivial. Like, there's a huge volume of people now that are talking about, we need to be taking more feminine attitude towards the world, the masculine attitude of exploit and business and enterprise and all that is destroying the world. It's a negative, evil God. And so what we actually look to femininity as intelligent, as sophisticated, as having a more delicate way of dealing with things, a more systematic and comprehensive way, whereas the blunt derp mode masculine energy that kind of just like flops itself out there and sees the forest and doesn't have any appreciation or sacredness for the forest, just kind of says, cut that up. And it's really ugly, and it's really disgusting when you kind of see it that way. Now I think this is the perception that's going on here. You would see that energy as negative, whereas of course the capitalist who is Christian would see that as the most glorious energy of all, and see all this feminine stuff as like nonsense, and even this descent into the ignorance of trusting your feelings too much and getting lost in this type of thing. And then you can imagine those people who run down to Peru and take ayahuasca and all that to get in touch with the forest, get in touch with the Great Mother. They're literally, they see, imagine how glorious they see that thing. They'd see that stuff as beautiful, and they'd see emotions as the portal into that beautiful thing. And it's very artistic and seductive and all these type of things. And it speaks to a sort of whole different person, whole different worldview. And it's happening right now in our reality as much as it was back then. So very, very interesting stuff.
Yeah, and speaking of Christianity, you can see how this shift towards the masculine and towards the father happened in the Bible, in Genesis. In Genesis, you have a moral story of disobeying God, obviously, but again, judging it aesthetically, judging it like as if it were a poem, so to speak, which is not, but judging it aesthetically. You see an image of a woman on a snake, a woman, a snake,
yeah,
and the tree of life.
Yeah.
Okay. And when woman consorts, so to speak, with her snake, then it's when man falls from the garden. Okay.
That's super
in
interesting.
Genesis. There's a very telling passage, almost, you don't have to make that up, where just after God realizes what has happened, he turns to the snake and he says, I'm going to put an enmity between you and woman. Her children are going to step on yours, and yours are going to bite the heels of hers. So right then and there, that image that you had before was split. The woman and her snake were split psycho-spiritually, almost in the collective unconscious, as you say, of these people. And that world that Minoan Crete was part of, that world of the Great Mother, was destroyed on two fronts. On the north, you had the Indo-Europeans, and on the east, you had the Semitic tribes. Mm-hmm. Okay, the Semitic tribes overrunning from the east, the Indo-Europeans overrunning from the north in waves. It's not like, like the way, obviously, we describe history in very, very broad strokes. It's not like a row of chariot warriors were waiting for a signal to attack, and that's when it happened. It came in waves. It was very hit and miss, I can imagine. But ultimately, they did conquer. And there is kind of a date around the 12th century BC. I think some archaeologists have pinpointed that date, something like 1117 or something like that, where that old world, that Bronze Age, that Great Mother Goddess world came crashing down and on the whole.
Yeah.
So in the Bible, you still, although the Bible is probably the most sky-oriented religion, you still have these traces, these images hidden in the narrative of this pre-Semitic religion, where woman consorting with a snake was a good thing because that provided for life. That was a symbol of fertility. The snake is a symbol of fertility across many, many cultures. And the idea is that the snake kind of gets born again by shedding its skin, And obviously you have the symbol of the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, So woman, snake, these were all symbols of fertility and inexhaustible life that just keeps outpouring from a mysterious source. Because remember, a lot of these old religion came from a time when humans had not connected childbirth with intercourse. Okay, so
really, so how did that work? How did they?
Because they had intercourse all the time and they had children all the time, so they didn't connect the two.
Wow.
But that's in like Paleolithic years. It's just a theory. But it's a theory that I've read. I think even Joseph Campbell supported that. So the idea is that woman does not need to be fertilized. Woman is bringing on new life, like the earth is bringing on new life by herself, And it's only after when people realize that you need the active participation of the man to have new life that things began to shift. Yeah. But that, technology played a part, war played a big part. So now you go to Greece, which is the other side of that pinch. You have the Semitic tribes overrunning from the east, Indo-Europeans overrunning from the north. In Greece, you have more of a merger of a combination of the two. You have various myths that show traces, let's say, of that conquest. Okay, so Crete in Greek mythology is very telling of all that. Okay, Crete, the legend is the legend of King Minos. Okay, and it's a beautiful legend because King
is he
Minos,
the guy with the golden touch?
No, this is Midas.
Apologies.
Minos was like, he was a contester to the throne, okay? And he asked from Poseidon to send him a sign so that the Cretans will see that he was the chosen one. Poseidon agrees and he sends him a white bull that comes out of the sea with the instructions to sacrifice the bull back to Poseidon, the sea god. The bull gets sent. The Cretans are amazed at the beauty of this beast, and they make Minos king.
Could I just ask a little question? Was that bull the bull that went over to Phoenicia and stole the princess Europa and brought her over to Crete?
No, it was Zeus transformed, I think, into a bull. But still, you have these traces. Wherever you have bulls in Greek mythology, you're probably close to that substratum, Minoan of pre-Indo-European. Wherever you read snakes, bulls, witches, moon, some kind of moon worship, these were all the symbols of that pre-Indo-European culture, that Minoan, let's call it for simplicity. It wasn't just Minoans, were a subset of this big culture that stretched probably from modern day Iran to perhaps Ireland.
Yeah. There's so many things I want to ask you about this, by the way. So the bull thing. So one question is: the bull thing related to the old god Moloch at all?
Yeah, it could be. I'm not that, but
because we had a god of child sacrifice in Ireland known as Crom Cruach, and I believe he was a bull too.
Very possibly, if he's a god of sacrifice, very possibly the golden calf that the Hebrews worshipped before Moses brought the commandments is also an echo, But the bull, and actually Joseph Campbell had a perfect. Since you're on it, we might find it. If you type Joseph Campbell bull plowing or something like that. He took a picture, or he found a picture that kind of shows you why the bull was considered this magical animal of fertility. You know, it's somewhere
right there. I've got an awful fucking browser. Someone told me to install this crappy browser and it doesn't work.
well, but it's an image you're going to see. Because Joseph Campbell had this big series called Mosques of God. There were 4 volumes where he takes you through world mythology, and he had like a simplified version of I can't see it here.
Yeah, this doesn't look right. This just looks like a load of boyos with their bull. So it's Joseph Campbell. I'll just go.
But anyway, he had a bull. I'm just going to describe it. Okay, he had a bull, and it was an image of the bull with an old plow, and the plow would the way this picture was shot, the plow would almost look like it was going under his legs, therefore looking like his penis, entering the earth, fertilizing the earth.
Yes.
It comes from this agrarian world. The bull, the plowing animal, was the masculine principle that fertilized the feminine, the earth. Okay. At the same time, the bull was a sacrificial animal, because in the pre-Indo-European, and again, painting it in very broad strokes and to the degree that we and I can know it, but let's go off on a limb here. In the pre-Indo-European mindset could be represented as the earth and the moon around it. Okay, so the earth in archaic times is immobile. Okay, it's geocentric. It's the center of the universe. It's and around it spins this ephemeral planet that is born and dies. Okay, as the moon waxes and wanes. As the moon waxes and wanes, so does the masculine principle lives, dies, and is born again. So the feminine principle was seen as dominant, representing the earth, representing fertility. And the masculine principle was somehow seen as more mortal. More mortal.
So interesting.
And you have all these symbols connected together, because the waxing, I guess, of the moon would turn the moon into a horn, which would link back to the bull.
Yes.
Okay, so the bull was that sacrificial animal, was the masculine principle that, in the words of Stephen Crane, he had this war poem. He said, "We men are born to drill and die. We men are born to drill and die." And that is very much that pre-Indo-European mindset. Men are born to drill, to plow, to fertilize, to enter, and then die in their prime. Why why waste another reincarnation? Because these cultures would, taking from being inspired by the change of the seasons and by the fact that everything around them died and was born again the next year, so man will die and be born again. Yeah. So human sacrifice, again, I was talking about how dark this image of that girl seems to us now. Human sacrifice is perhaps the darkest thing that we can think of, but perhaps not for them. Perhaps not for them. I mean, think about it. If you're guaranteed to be born again pretty much in the same environment, why waste your time in old age? Why not go at your prime and have another go? So
it's so fucking interesting, man. And like,
very different mindset that to us, the reason that all these things appear very dark, very, 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 very mysterious, very mystical, is perhaps because we have mainly inherited that Indo-European rather than pre-Indo-European mindset.
I can even think about how the Indo-Europeans would have perceived the idea of death different, because with the whole sky god thing, the idea is that you reach heaven if you achieve glory that is high enough. And that's even true
Exactly.
in Christianity. And so
Exactly.
the kind of message you'd give to a man would be like, all right, so in this old culture, it's like sacrifice is actually a good thing because it allows you to be favorably reborn as a more beautiful being. Whereas in the Indo-European thing, it's like either you achieve something worthy of ascending, or you will sink back down into the earth, into the darkness. And
Exactly. Exactly.
that's a different message to tell a man. Absolutely, that's an incredibly different message to tell a man.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. There's a huge host of things I want to talk about. And by the way, people, I think what we're going to slowly start getting towards, just because we know we're talking about Apollo and Dionysus, is I believe that this more feminine way of looking at things is, or shall we say, the more feminine-centered religion and the whole mystery of it and all that. This actually starts to lead towards what we could call the Dionysian cults, and the Apollyon mindset is the other one. But I think we'll get to that gradually. I do have another question about something very, very prescient to me. Yes, I've heard about this idea of the sun as masculine and the moon as feminine, but actually that was inverted in these. So you would have the sun as feminine and the moon as masculine. So the sun is the generative power of fertility, whereas so that's interesting. The sun is almost always the fertile power, but you can place the gender on that depending on what you believe and see about the world. And so your mind will change your perceptions of that. It reminds me a lot of, as we said, the way things are sort of going now, if you will, where there's this sort of attitude that masculinity is now expendable to some extent. And
Yes. Yes.
this sort
And
of this sort
yeah.
of idea now is that, like, even in the way fertility works, like, this might sound a bit bleak, but I guess like the ideal would be that you get men in their prime to go to a sperm bank and then like pop all their juice inside there till you have this giant bag of like high quality juice. And then what happens is everybody goes out and everybody is sort of like semi-sterilized via abortions, or maybe even like, chemically, they're all taking some type of chemicals. So everybody's like these pre-Indo-Europeans, they're all having sex all the time. There's, Brave New World type thing going on. And
Of
there's,
course, we're thinking in very parallel terms. I always saw the 60s as a revival, as a return of the great mother goddess.
wow, that's so interesting. That's so interesting. And so this is this sort of ascendant power right now, because then obviously the goal is to go back to the idea that it's almost like the female which chooses what is born, what is created. And so we're putting the power back to a woman to say that, like, all right, you'll have sex thousands of times in your life, but when you want to have a baby, you go to the sperm bank and you sort of take up all the pictures of all the fathers, and then you pick which one you want, and then that will be her having the ultimate power in some sense.
Yes, and you mentioned the Gaia cult,
Yeah.
which is very interesting because especially in the conservative camp, people in the conservative camp tend to see, the sustainable development movement as
Yeah.
Marxist or socialist. Okay, the reality is that if you actually look at their metaphysics, for want of a better term, the metaphysics of the eco movements from the 1960s, they're not Marxist at all.
Yeah.
They need socialist. They need socialist planning because their projects are so effing big that they need to suck, literally, like you said, the metaphors are there. Suck the life blood from the young men who go out and work and pay for those taxes, mostly young men, and to feed back. But it's not Marxist in its spiritual principle, because Marx and Marxism, as ironic as it sounds for an ideology that is responsible for the death of millions, was humanitarian in a strange way, in that it placed man and beyond man, mankind, at the center of history.
Yeah.
Man was the pinnacle of nature. Nature itself is not featured in Marx's works almost at all, and of course you could say they didn't know enough, but the idea is that man is the maker of history. Man is what it's all about. if you look at the ecology movements that began in the 1960s, it's not man, it's the earth.
Mm-hmm.
Man is sometimes considered a virus, sometimes
Yes.
considered something to be done away with. And the whole metaphysics are not Marxist, they are Minoan, as strange as it sounds. And I always saw in these movements a kind of return. And my idea is that, you know, that Indo-European, now, here's an interesting question talking about Indo-Europeans, okay? So if we agree more or less that this Indo-European expansion, conquest, however you want to call it, began around second millennia BC, something like 1700, 1800, 1900, 1500, we can be sure, somewhere around there. Let's say that the bigger waves began there, okay? And conquered you. When would you say that it ended?
Well, I just from my history stuff, I believe it ended after about 500, 1,000 years, like 4,000 years ago or something. I don't know.
Well, let's say it started. So let's say it started 4,000 years ago, roughly.
Oh, you mean the entire kind of cycle of the kind of ascendant ideology, if you will?
Yeah.
I'd imagine it only ended like 100 years ago, to be honest.
Exactly.
But yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
That's where I was going. It actually, it's incredible. It actually ended only 100 years ago. Even if you take Indo-European by its most minimal definition, which is the language,
Mm-hmm.
and the expansion of that language group,
Mm-hmm.
it really only ended 100 years ago. We are literally some of the first generations of that culture that are not expanding, they're contracting.
Yeah.
You know, so it's very difficult today to say it in those terms, but you know how, especially since the 60s, people have become very sensitive, you know, to the dispossession of Native Americans, to the dispossession of even the gypsies in Europe, you know, to all these cultures that have been to a certain degree ostracized. Well, you know, actual Europeans are not faring that much better, you know.
Yeah.
We are literally, we are some of the first generations who live without the horse.
Yes, that's true. Actually, yeah, that's true.
And
they're taking our culture. What are they doing? Although the way you framed everything there, I kind of understand why people can come with the most historically like inarticulate thesis that Irish people were colonial slavers. You kind of can vaguely see their point. It's not like they understand this, but if you put 4,000 years into context, you're kind of like, I guess the Irish are Indo-Europeans somewhere around the back.
If you put it in that context, but you know, the moment, I think the watershed moment was the First World War.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It's end of the horse rider. You know, very.
Oh yeah, that's
so
true. That's so
First
true.
World War. You know, and you can think about this ideal. You know, and again, I don't necessarily care how much of that is historical, because we're talking about the culture, and the culture is built on an interpretation of history. Okay, and we're talking about the collective unconscious. We're talking, you know, for people who might be listening and say it wasn't exactly the 17th century. So fair enough, and I would love to hear the comments, and I'm going to respond to as many comments as I can. You know, I'm no historian myself, but I'm not trying to be. You know, I'm trying to delve into the psyche, so to speak. You know, into the psyche of ancient Greece, and naturally going there, you have to delve into the entire Indo-European psyche and what came before it. You know, so you know, this idea of the horse rider, part history, part myth. I'm happy to admit that came down and swept over Europe, crossed the Atlantic, became the Hidalgo, became the cowboy. You know,
yeah,
the cowboy legend
Holy shit! I didn't even
These,
think of that. I
and
must just if I could briefly, for any boyos who are not up to scratch on this. So basically, these Minoan people, these Minoans, we'll say the pre-Indo-European feminine cultures, we'll call them. But they were glorious people. Like, you see them around Ireland, they have some brilliant stuff, and it's really really interesting people worth studying, like what we're doing now. But they were essentially technologically behind. You can imagine nowadays, if you decided you're running a business and you said, fuck the internet's not that important. And then, 20 years later, you have some like tech dude who's like 27 and he's a billionaire because he made like a payment processor. And you realize that you were definitely behind and you should have got on board with the internet. And so something similar happened around about the turn of the Indo-Europeans, where these guys were up in, the steppes, like the Mongols. They loved horses, they loved eating meat, they loved kefir. They were really good at organizing together, and they built chariots. And so they swooped down on these guys who didn't really have a male culture at all. So they didn't really have a martial culture at all. It was all kind of like routine and farmer like. And they weren't prepared for when some fucking crazy bastard shows up, looking like some character out of Led Zeppelin and on a chariot, and starts like swooping in and just basically taking over. And you don't stand a chance against that, because as much as you think about it, like I was walking down the street the other day and two police officers rode by on two horses, and you just forget how fucking monstrous those creatures are. Horses are huge animals, and you wouldn't stand a hope against one of those. Even if you had like your spears and all that, you'd freak out, because they're beasts. They're huge things. And so these guys just swooped all the way from Russia all the way down to Spain. If you actually check the genetic history of Spain, it's quite bleak. All the men were just deleted by these guys. There's no trace of the men from before when the Indo-Europeans showed up in Spain. So every Spanish male is descended from these guys with the chariots, and they're all deleted. But the women, pre-Indo-European women, they survived because they were taken as war brides by the men. And so there was this huge transition. As you're saying, yeah, of course, the horseman, the horse archer that swoops with the chariot, then that turns into the American cowboy. And then World War I is famous for when they all charged into the trenches with horses and realized that it's the world of machines. That's such an interesting context. And I'm doing the Red Book now with Young, and the Red Book was based around World War I as well.
Yeah, I've heard some of your shows. They're great. Actually, that's how I came in contact. But, I think what happened in the battlefields of the First World War happened also in the collective psyche of Europeans, the death of the horse. And actually, this is how, as I remember, Joseph Campbell interpreted Picasso's Guernica. Okay, because in Picasso's Guernica, you have a horse and you have a bull and a few other figures, and the horse is seen almost as suffering, almost as dying, but the bull is like triumphant. And even then, Joseph Campbell saw a return of these pre-Indo-European principles, of these pre-Indo-European cultures. As the warrior is almost overtaken by technology, he's not, and a sense of nobility is lost from warfare as technology takes over. Across Europe, you'll find monuments of the unnamed soldier. Okay, and that represents those fallen in these very technological wars. The idea of the unnamed soldier for the Homeric man, or for someone like Cuchulainn in Irish mythology, or someone like Beowulf, someone like Achilles, the unnamed soldier, would be a disgrace. You want to be named. You want to proclaim your name and your father's name and your grandfather's name, going up to Zeus before you enter and perhaps die. You had to one last chance to shout, to proclaim, I am Beowulf, I am Achilles. But now you see how in modern warfare, the hero is that unnamed soldier. In those statues, you can see the death of the old ideal, of the old heroic ideal.
That's so. Oh, dude, can I just butt in for a sec? All right. So, taking with that what we were talking about, the idea of male fertility earlier. So you have this concept of the degenerative power of the bull, is that it's like very cyclical, and you sacrifice the bull at his prime because he'll just be reborn again. And so the male, because it's the sort of the moon-like sex, it actually it seeps into a sort of irrelevance. And the idea of immortality is that you can die as a nobody and be reborn as just as beautiful as you were before. So that's all those incentives are lined up. You contrast that with the horse-going sky god Indo-European, and he is obviously fighting to ascend into heaven, and he must achieve something worthy of making his name last forever in the realm of astral speech. That's literally how he lives forever. I think Heraclitus says the glory, and all men want the glory of their name lasting forever in the minds of man, or something like that. And Achilles is that, like, and he holds the sword up to the little boy, and the little boy says, I'd be too afraid to do that. And he says, that's why no one will remember your name. And it's absolutely, that's absolutely the thesis, is that this ascendant idea of you do it to last forever, to live forever. The great achievement that Achilles, Jesus Christ, all these people, they achieved is through the making their name echo throughout history, through the consciousness of man. Alexander the Great will be with us forever as long as there's humanity. Now, that's absolutely fascinating when you contrast that with World War I, which was the inversion of war back into that complete, it's a sacrifice thing. Like, it's just a deletion of vast vistitudes of essentially working class men and their generals. And it's just like, there's no point to it. Like, it's pointless. It's like, think about how it worked, though, right? Jesus, think about how it worked. They dug into the ground like the way you dig into fields, like you're plowing fields.
Yeah. Very. I never saw that before, but yeah, that's a very good image. Yeah.
And then when you think about Verdun and all that, like it's just fertilized by blood. That's all it was done. It was just like, it was churned up like mincemeat, like it was plowed, and then the machines fertilized it, and then you have these countless nameless millions just injected into the earth again, and for the fertility of the new age. And it was sort of routine, because you had one of those wars, and then 20 years later you had another war. And it's sort of God, that's a bleak way of seeing it, but yeah, I see what you're saying, man. That's absolutely fascinating.
All these things re-emerged in poetry in the beginning, right before and right after the First World War. Or in visions, like in the case of Jung. If you read the poetry of Wilfred Owen, who's one of my favorite poets, great soldier, he actually died at the age, I think, of 25, 26. He was wounded in, I think, 1917, and then he actually demanded that he returned to the front, and he died, right? And that's a man who wrote this big lament for the First World War. So again, a contradiction in our minds. How did he crave to return to the front, yet knowing that this war is this very dark, very turning point in human history? And his poems capture that. There's one poem where his team, his platoon finds an old church ruined by some bombardment, by some shelling. Most of the walls are gone, and he describes it as saying the saints, the pictures on the walls, have hid underground now. Even Wilfred Owen had a beautiful line in another poem talking about Jesus. He said, in this war, he, with a capital H, he too lost a limb. And in that other poem with the church, all the saints, including Jesus, have gone underground. Yet there's an image of the Madonna smiling back at them, he says, as if flattered by the war. Okay, so
that's so interesting, because what happened with women is that during that war, because all the men weren't in the factories, women got this really essential position in society, because they were all asked to work in the factories. And that actually proved that women could do men's jobs. And that was a huge boost to the feminist movement. And that was the sort of beginning of the acceptance of women into society as like key fundamental value producers. And on
the other hand, you have the white feathers. I don't know if you know that.
I don't know. What were they?
Oh, that you can pull up some pictures. The white feather World War I. You'll find it. The white feathers, you will like this one, I'm sure. There were groups of women in
I've
England,
heard this. Yeah.
perhaps in Ireland, who went around town to look for men who looked, fit enough for war, yet they were not in the front, and they would give them a white feather as a symbol of cowardice. You're not a real man, and they would shame them, and a lot of them, a lot of these men would actually conscript the next day.
Suffragettes pinned a white feather of a symbol of cowardice. That's amazing.
There was an article on The Guardian of a woman who wrote about her grandfather, who was one of these men who were shamed by the white feather and went to join the front the next day. He survived, but very, very, very broken. He passed, according to this article, at least he passed the rest of his days kind of staring at the wall, kind of thing. So
15 years old, man. Holy shit. That is so intense, man. And it is like, it's one of those things where it's got the secret cruelty of the feminine in it, where you'd have a kid of 15 and like, like these girls would have never understood what a trench warfare is like. And believe me, when you study that, you realize that it is not a place you want to be sending a young boy of 15. The Germans, after they had a lot of kids who were about 19 and they sent them into fight, and they actually ended up against the Scotland Yard, one of the best divisions in all of England. And the Scotland Yard just mowed them down. And the Germans to this day call that the Kindermord. That was the kind of moment when the Germans sort of said, all right, this war is a dirty war. It's a bad war. Like it's not as glorious as we thought it was. It's not quite the same. It's just a massacre, And that was one of those instances where, they throw away a classroom full of kids who were all friends, who would obviously a huge amount of potential, really healthy, prime, coming up to their prime, and they threw them away. Not even for an inch of land. It was pointless, that type of thing.
And you also, look, reading biographies of people who lived around that time, you will find very often the testimonies of people that were judged unfit for war. Okay, and if you're reading their biographies, they're obviously great writers, great politicians, great something. They were so they were definitely healthy on some respect, but the frequency with which you hear this unfit for war back then tells me that the standards were very high. You could not, like Muhammad Ali was turned down in the beginning to be sent to Vietnam. Later, they lowered the standards, and he was asked to go for perhaps political reasons as well. But in the first draft for Vietnam, he was turned down because of IQ. And he had this brilliant line when they asked him. He said, "I said I'm the greatest, not the smartest."
I fucking love that, man. That's really
but you see, like, the standards were very high. So these children that you speak of that were gunned down were not just children, young men actually, which is tragic enough. They were the best. They
were the sharpest, the health. Wow.
They were the sharpest, the healthiest. You had asthma, you couldn't go. You were too short, you couldn't go. They had all these weird sicknesses back then. He's anemic. He's he has a frail disposition. He has neurasthenia. They had all these reasons that could turn you down. Now you just take a pill and off you go. But back then, these men that died were really, really, really the cream.
This is probably going to get us in a bit of trouble, but there's a really, really interesting spin on this where, all right, so we had during this war, and again, this is not, we're saying there's no like conspiracy about this at all, but just an observation, all right? We had this war where all these incentives, emotional incentives, almost like mythical religious things, no one's really in control of this, come into being at the same time, and it ends up being like this sort of sacrifice of the prime bull European male, and that essentially just destroys the genetic stock of Europe. Is probably the best way you can understand, or Northern Europe at least, the best way you can understand this. So it just absolutely ruins this. And then World War II certainly doesn't fucking help either. And then that's done. So that's like, you know, the people who survive are the ones who stay at home, and they're, you know, they're not the best. And it's very similar to the way the Minoans, they probably would have made the mistake of sacrificing their healthiest too often, and then slowly their population would have got weaker and weaker and weaker, and that leaves you primed to be taken over by quote unquote Indo-Europeans, you know. And then you wonder about the whole, you know, the way there's like Islam is having this big, strong ascendant movement in Europe right now, and that's so interesting because it's a very sky religion. You know what I mean? It's got that masculine energy about it. And you talk to Muslims, like, and they, you know, it's interesting. Like, I think what people don't understand is that the Muslims don't really enjoy coming here and then having all, you know, the liberals turn around and be like, give up Islam, or, you know, make Islam more feminine. And they're sort of like, no, like, we're Muslims, like, leave us with our thing. And they sort of have this attitude that they sort of see European culture as the same way as I'd imagine Indo-Europeans would see the Minoans. They see it as, they don't, like, you know, it's not like sort of a hate thing, but they see it as like, guys, like, you're sort of fallen in some sense. Like, what are you doing to yourself?
Very much. Yeah.
And I've spoken to them in that thing, and it's super interesting because their religion has this, as I said, this ascendant masculine ideal, this air way of thinking, you know, this upwards way of thinking, the spreading of the prophet's law around the world, that type of thing. So that's a really quite frightening, but very, very interesting thing at the same time.
Yeah, and you know, another thing that happened in the First World War was, again, talking symbolically, the ascendancy of the magician rather than the warrior.
Wow, yeah. Holy
again,
shit.
quoting, and there is this. It's very interesting to me in literature in general. Again, quoting from Owen, he has another poem. It's called The Hospital Barge, where everyone wants to look at it, very, very beautiful, where that's how I realized the Somme was a river, okay? Because there at the Somme, there's a river and there's a hospital barge that passes, and the whole image in the poem is very quiet, very heavy and quiet, and you can only hear the turning of the engine slowly in this still river surface. And then at the end of the poem, the boat turns, passing in front of a man reading, perhaps the poet himself, saying, one reading by that calm bank, shaded eyes, to see her lessening westward quietly. Then, as she took the bend, her funnel screamed, and that long lamentation made him wise, how unto Avalon kings passed in the dark barge that Merlin dreamed. So you have that image there.
That's absolutely fascinating, of the rise of the out of the darkness, the rise of the magician. And you have this sort of similar, like what World War I was a tech war. Like what won that war is, I don't know if you've ever seen the pictures of the Germans. They're like, it's actually a kind of like comical just how excessive this stuff is. German artillery, World War One. It's like, look at the size of some of these machines. Look at this. Like, I think apparently the French and the British, when they found these, they were just like, fucking Germans. Like, they're so good at building stuff. It's kind of crazy. And
I remember in one episode there was this gun they had to bring on train.
Yeah, like, there it is. There.
Yeah, each carriage would carry a part of that gun, and they would need to pour concrete like they were building a house.
Yeah.
Just to place it on, and then it would,
these were monsters. It's apparently monsters, and they would park up in the middle of, like, you know, probably the Ardennes somewhere or something like that, and then like fire 50 miles away at Paris. They're like shooting cross countries.
2 minutes for that shell to go, like it went up for 3 minutes and then came down for another 3, something like that. So they were big.
And you know, there's a little bit of irony here as well. Just like, this is just my myth mind is turned on. But if you think about it, like, that is a magician's thing, to create the machine. And of course, like, look at the symbology here. Like, this is a phallus, of course. So this is where the masculine energy has now moved, it seems. That's very interesting.
Yes, absolutely. Joseph Campbell, again, we used to quote a myth. I don't know where it came from, unfortunately. I wanted to look it up, where a prince falls in love with a wife of the king or something like that. The king finds out and castrates him. And then he goes to the east, to Persia, where he learns dark magic and comes back and puts the whole kingdom to sleep. And then a hero has to go. That symbol of the castrated magician that puts the kingdom to sleep, I think is very fitting to perhaps even what's going on now.
That's actually such a good point. Holy shit.
And all these things, they reemerge in art, especially in the minor arts, like comic books.
Yeah.
Because comic books, for many decades, they escaped censorship, back in the 50s. Not escaped it totally, but they were far from the eyes of critics.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 1950s, you would never put a comic book page next to whatever was fashionable at the time, Jason Pollock or something like that. The one was high art, the other was low art. But it's in this low art that you find this collective dream. And you have Conan the Barbarian as in the film, and if you watch the symbols, you have the arch enemy is the magician.
Yeah.
Right. And you have this.
That's.
He was the actor that gave his voice to Darth Vader. Actually, I don't remember his name. The big black dude, very very good actor, very imposing. And you had Schwarzenegger on the other side. Yeah, and there's this beautiful scene. Because the film is better than I remembered. I used to think it was Hollywood trash, but actually a friend of mine a few years back told me, you have to rewatch it. It's actually better than you remember. And he was right. So there's this scene at the end where they're in this like stepped pyramid, it looks like, and there's this magician who's casting his spells. And underneath the kingdom, the people look like a 90s hippie rock concert.
Wow, that's amazing.
And then our Conan goes to the top. He was struggling, to find the secret of steel. So he goes up to the pyramid, and you think there's going to be this great battle, between the two, but there isn't. It's almost like they're nodding, and then Conan takes his sword and with one move just cuts the head of the magician, picks it up, shows it to the people, and then in one great special effect because the crowd looks huge, like the entire world perhaps, and they all go in one motion, boom, and they pray to him. That's
so badass, because that's so similar to what's going on. There's this sort of as you're saying, this sort of, oh man, I've got such a riff on this. Are you finished? I don't want to interrupt too much.
Yeah. No. It's just this one thing. That moment, perhaps I read too much into it, but that moment before this cutting of the head happens, and again, you think it's going to be this big standoff, but it's not. And it's almost like the magician nods. It's almost like he was yearning for that. Almost like he too was caught inside of his own spell. So take it, yeah.
Wow, that's such an amazing read. Holy shit, man. This is actually getting like fucking crazy now that we're digging into it. And so just on that idea, like I'm sort of going to do the sin of making explicit what is sort of implicit. This idea of we have the transition out of the horse, the ascendant, the higher, the air version of mythology, that contrasts itself with the feminine world that must be shaped towards the rational energies of the conscious man and all this stuff. And we have this transition point then with World War I, which is just unbelievably poignant, which is that transition point sinking back down into the as we said, the sacrificial being, where you have man not as someone who's going to achieve glory glory, but man who's literally sacrifices himself towards the society back home, and he is irrelevant, and his lack of name is actually his glory. The fact that he humbly does that and doesn't ask to be known is actually a symbol of him, and it's almost this defeat of masculine energy, or this sidelining of masculine energy. It ties in with so many things that you kind of think this is definitely something that's going on. It's not just some theory by two boyos. And then obviously around about that, you have the ascension of the technological man, the machine man, the master of engineering, the magician, as you say. And so, as you also implied as well, like if you look at what's going on now, the people who have dominion over the world are those who have these huge platforms with which they can plug as many people as possible into like via like this giant, almost like collective mind machine, like a hive or something like that. And everybody's plugged in like the Matrix, and they're all entranced by literally fucking spells. Like that's what it's like. It's like mind control or something like that. And I'm not sure if it's necessarily intentional. It's just the way the game works, if you will. All the incentives point towards people achieving this. And so you have these people who are rising up, and they're hardly, you know, not to be slandering them, but they're hardly like specimens. They're hardly Schwarzenegger, you know. They're like, a lot of them are very skinny, very socially awkward, that type of thing. And they have everybody in this trance. And it's actually funny what you say. I do imagine that on some level, you know, they don't feel comfortable with what's going on. Like you look at our man over at Facebook, and he does actually feel, I don't know, I get a vibe off him that it's sort of like, you know, he's like an introvert, and he's been shoved into this position of like one of the most famous people on the earth, and it kind of looks uncomfortable, and people hate him, you know, because he's not socially adept. And so people are like, oh, he's an alien. They say all this shit. Maybe he is, I don't know. But they say all this shit about
There's
him.
definitely something very, very off about
Yeah,
it.
and I would put that just down to like the introversion. Like I've spoke to loads of tech dudes like this, and like either he is genuinely, you know, reptilian overlord or something like that, or he is just simply a dude who would rather be in the back room working on the computer, and he's been thrust into the position of like, you know, the one of the richest, most famous people on earth. And we know from history that the rich are going to be the target of an immense amount of resentment. You know, it's going to be incomprehensible. And so he's in that position. And as you said, he's literally like almost like on the top of the pyramid. And people give out about his censorship and all that stuff. But actually, if you think about it, he's sort of kind of getting everybody on this pyramid. And then their emotions are demanding. It's like, you know, get rid of these people off our platform. And oftentimes you kind of get this feeling that perhaps it's not even him he's not sitting there being like, I'm going to censor all these people. He's sort of saying there's literally a mob, and they've like, you know, what do you do when 4 million people have demanded that you get rid of this person or something like this, or you stop this message from spreading? You kind of have to bow to it, you know, you're not really in control in that sense. And so, that seems to be the sort of ascendant power right now. What it is, it's the tech lord, the engineer, machine man, that type of thing. And it's a weird feeling. Like absolutely, there's all these things kind of colliding together. And I guess you do offer an interesting thesis of, or maybe what you're noticing. Maybe it's like, I'm not saying you're coming up with this, but you're noticing these patterns. Points to some fascinating theses, such as, you know, if the redeeming airman rises up and actually removes the magician from his uncomfortable spell, like it might save things. And actually, just on a little note there as well, in terms of movies, have you ever seen Apocalypto?
Yes.
So it's a very, very similar set of themes that you're talking about. You have, you know, the sort of man of the earth, and then he gets dragged into the falling, decaying city world, where you have the magician, you know, sacrificing young men towards this mob who are all weird and dressed funny and all this, and almost like caught up in some spell of some sort. So yeah, dude, that's an amazing thesis. Holy shit, we haven't really hit Birth of Tragedy that much at all.
But what we can link to, we've been teasing people enough, so we can link to it. And, you know, coming to the mythology of ancient Greece, you can almost read this scene where these two cultures, the Indo-European and the Minoan, let's call it from now, where they joined. And there's various myths that are the stitches, let's say, on that scene. One is actually the birth of Dionysus. Okay, so the birth of Dionysus, the myth is that Zeus, sky god, Indo-European god, falls in love with, to say it politely, with Semele, Semele is her name. She's a mortal woman. Whether her name means earth is a possibility. The Orphics had this phrase, soma, sema. Soma is body, like somatic, and sema, like cemetery, actually, I think.
Okay.
The earth, sema, was the... so sema, earth, semele, it could be a possibility. She could be like a fallen earth goddess. But however that turns out, she is pregnant with child. Okay, Hera, who's the jealous wife of Zeus, wants to wreak revenge, but can't, because Semele, is protected by Zeus, her lover. So she goes down and she talks to Semele, and she tells her, she says, you think you've been with a god, but he wasn't. For you, he had to turn into a man to be with you. Only with me, he appears in his true godly, like said, a few modern women might have the same. So she says, Hera tells Semele, says, you have to ask him. You have to ask him. He promised to fulfill one of your wishes. You have to ask him to reveal himself in his godly Zeus-like nature. So next time Zeus comes down, she says, you promised, that's what I want. Zeus understands, it's all ploy, says, no, please, anything but that. The old image, the old idea that mortal eyes cannot stand the sight of God, the naked sight of God you find throughout all mythologies. So she asks exactly for that, for Zeus to reveal himself as a true God. He cannot resist her because he promised, so he does. He explodes in a vision of thunder, burning her down. And at that moment, Euripides has this beautiful phrase in Greek, keravnia niphi, is the lightning's bride. She became the lightning's bride, talking about all these Spanish men, pre-Spanish men who got killed in Spanish women. The Spanish women became the lightning's bride in that respect. Okay, and so she gets burned, but she had still the child in her body, who was half divine, half mortal, half his father Zeus, half hers. So Zeus takes pity on the child, takes the child, and cuts his thigh open, stitches the child in, from which he is born again as Dionysus, the twice born, as is called, once from his mother, once from his father. So in that myth, that's one of these stitches where the sky-worshipping Indo-European came conquered, but did not obliterate, assimilated to a certain degree, that Minoan pre-Indo-European culture. And you have various myths that almost froze that moment into the collective unconscious, So Dionysus is clearly the one who got away, let's say. He was the bull god as he's appeared. He was the dying god. He was the sacrificial, ever dying, ever resurrected god of Minoan Crete, or of that culture that was Minoan Crete. He was, but he was saved from that. The Earth Mother could no longer be dominant, because now the Sky Father took over. So she was demoted. She became a river nymph. She became an earth spirit. She became various things. Okay, you find these examples throughout Europe. What's very interesting is that as you go from, say, Greece, which was right at the center of this descent of the Indo-Europeans, you go towards Ireland, case in point, you find this weakening, you find this masculine sky principle slowly weakening. And until you reach Ireland, you have very dominant, you still have a more or less, kind of Indo-European culture, but you have much more dominant female characters. For example, you have witches who are non-existent in the Iliad. Okay, in the Odyssey, they make a reappearance. But in the Odyssey, you have exactly that. You have Odysseus who leaves this Greek world and travels in the Mediterranean and all these islands that we have no idea exactly which islands they were. could be Malta, could be Sicily, could be Corse, could be Ibiza, could be any of these islands. But what he finds there is these very powerful women like Circe, like Calypso.
Wow, wow,
So he
wow.
leaves that locus, and one way to see it is that he needs to become a complete man now and return home. He needs to go from that barbaric warrior, castle seizing, woman conquering. He needs to be a complete man. So he needs to go into the collective unconscious of his culture, of Greece. The collective unconscious being that layer of culture that was suppressed, that Minoan layer that was pushed down. Okay.
That's such a good take. Holy shit, that sparked my mind to no end. Keep going, man. Sorry.
In the Odyssey, you have this little telltale where in the beginning and in the end, he kind of falls asleep and wakes up. So at the end, when he goes to Ithaca, and this is obviously a poetic device because he didn't need to, when he finds a way to go back. He's at the court of a king and of the Phaeacians, however you pronounce it in English. And he's finally given a boat to go back home. He's put to sleep by the gods and he wakes up back home. The journey was not that long. It's not like in science fiction, you have to be cryogenically to go. He could have taken, but there must be something to this idea that as he re-enters his home, he goes to sleep and wakes up as if he was waking up from a dream.
That's so
Which was the whole journey. And in Ireland, the heroes, when they go out, like Odysseus, they find themselves into almost a surreal, dreamlike land where the previous tribe, however you pronounce it in Irish, Tuatha De Danann,
Tuatha De Danann, yeah.
Existed before Cochran, before this Indo-European, and these fairy castles that appear and disappear.
I think Irish myth got a slightly different angle, but most certainly there's this common motif in Irish myth of the other world. And
Yes.
Tír na Nog. So Tír na Nog means place of the young. Og is young. And Cuchulainn, for example, does the typical hero's journey where he runs off to some island which is ruled by a woman, I believe, or a woman warrior. And he basically the same story as that sort of Amazon type ideal and all that type of stuff. But more so with the Tuatha Dé, people of Day, the Tuatha De Danann. When they arrive in Ireland, there's a people who live there known as the Fomorians, and I believe they're probably the Neolithic Minoans, perhaps. Okay, well, I'm going to go with that for the time being. And the Fomorians are seen as the dark-haired people, the native people. It's actually very, very interesting. So they're ruled by a sort of glass tower in the sea, which there's a person called, I think it's Balor, and he has an evil eye. And when Tolkien read about this is where he got the inspiration for Sauron, from Lord of the Rings, of the evil eye. And so the Fomorians, you could visualize, maybe, this might be a bit intense in the poor Fomorians.
Even their name sounds evil.
Yes, and you could visualize them a little bit like the orcs, if you want. You can think of it that type of way. That's sort of a mild version. The Irish myth might have a slightly milder version. Why do I say that? Because the Irish gods often, marry, mate, and mix with these Fomorians, these natives of Ireland, basically. And so what you're describing there of Odysseus going around and interacting with all this stuff, the Irish myth is actually hugely, at the start, hugely about these interactions, hugely about these two sort of people and their super myths coming in contact with each other and understanding each other and blending together and interacting. And they serve this sort of foundation. And it's a very, very interesting thing. That's an amazing thesis you put forward. Absolutely amazing. And there's something else I want to kind of speak to about this as well. Is have I lost it? Damn, there's so much there. Yeah, there's if I sort of imagine history in a Hegelian way, where you're looking at it's being driven by forces, and the big challenge philosophically is to actually grab the correct forces. So if you think it's like a war between good and evil, and Nietzsche's going to get very, very mad at you and say, no, you're not looking at it right. And he'd be like, try master and slave. That's more interesting. And then what we're sort of doing here implicitly, and I'm not saying you're suggesting this, but it's something you can look at, is that if you take the genders and extrapolate their psychology into like these forces, what tends to happen is there's sort of like the feminine way of seeing the world and the masculine way of seeing the world. And what's weird is that, you know, men can fall into the feminine dream. They can fall into that. And then they become like Minoan men, if you will. And that has a particular way of seeing the world, a particular dynamic, and that actually creates a sort of typical set of patterns and ideals. And it's almost like a force, almost like a fundamental force. And this other way of seeing things is less common, but most certainly present. And that's becomes like, you know, you could say, to give the feminists their due, the patriarch way of doing things. Like I believe the Romans called themselves patricians for that reason. The Orthodox church over there in the East calls themselves patriarchs up on top.
Yeah. And on that note, falling into the female dream, people report this all the time with psychedelics.
Interesting. They report the...
You probably know Sam Harris.
Yeah.
And he had a video, very, very beautiful. That's probably...
Give me 1 second. Sorry there, brother. Keep going.
Yeah. He kind of not exactly came out, because it's still consistent with what he said, but he had a video about a couple of months ago where he took a heroic dose of psilocybin mushrooms, and he made a video, very, very honest and very daring in that the way he was speaking. He wasn't exactly countering what he said before, but the way he was speaking about it was, dare I say, a little mystical, you know, for such a man. And he said, I remember, he said, I can't describe it in full, but the pattern of dismemberment and ritual sacrifice was there in his dream, in his psychedelic trip. Yet it was all done with love. Okay, so if we can imagine going to the Minoan mindset, dismembering someone with love, that contradiction can show you how different perhaps these people might have thought about life. Terence McKenna had this...
that's such an interesting way of seeing it, because that's... and that's what the shaman used to have. Terence
McKenna had this, the verbal, non-stop artillery. He said, what I wanted to see when I got into the psychedelics is bejeweled ruins where phosphorescent maidens howled demon songs on a purple moon.
Yeah.
Okay, that's that mother world, you know, that weird, like, Minoan world.
But that's what happens to Dionysus, isn't it? He gets dismembered by Maenads.
Yeah. So going into the birth of tragedy.
Finally.
Yeah. So before even Nietzsche wrote his book, Birth of Tragedy, which is an excellent book on the subject, before he wrote that, the ancient Greeks themselves had a myth about how tragedy was born. Okay, and they believed it was history. Perhaps it was, perhaps it wasn't. But the idea was that it all started with the celebrations of Dionysus. Okay, so Dionysus was not part of the pantheon. Okay, he was not part of the 12 gods. He was almost like a 13th god, which shows you that he did not come from this Indo-European sky-worshipping world, you know. Yet he was very present in ancient Greece. Technically, you could say he was a minor god, but he was a minor god in the way Jesus is not, you know, rather in the way Mother Mary is for Europeans. You know, technically she was a woman, she was mortal, but she has this exalted place even higher than the Orthodox church would like her to be, perhaps, so Dionysus, technically he was a demigod, but for the Greeks he was very, very popular, and his rituals always happened outside the city, because the gods of the city were the gods of this sky pantheon. So outside in the rural areas, you had the celebrations of Dionysus, and you had the ritual dancing, the ritual singing in circles, okay, representing that pre-Indo-European circular life coming and going, reincarnating pattern, okay? One day, the Greek legend has it, a man who was part of this circle stood in the middle of the circle and started to recite poetry, not sing it, recite it in verse, to which the chorus responded. That moment was the birth of tragedy. And that was the first kind of tragedy, with one actor talking not to another actor, but to the chorus, representing these two great spiritual principles. The individuated ego, who understands linear time, understands concrete, separate things, understands separateness, understands beginning, middle, and end of one's life, talking to this eternal pattern of coming and going and reincarnating. That's what Nietzsche took and ran with it, if you will. It was what the Greeks themselves thought it was.
Oh, that is a fucking nuclear bomb. That's so in how I process that is so good. So the sort of thesis I was rolling with there was that you sort of look at history being driven by these two fundamental forces, and I call one of them feminine and the other is masculine, all right? And the feminine one is obviously this Minoan thing, and it's the goddess-centered cults, if you will. This is how they used to be described, the mystery cults perhaps as well. In Ireland we had Bridget, and we also had the Fomorians. In Greece you had the Minoans. I'm sure in medieval Christianity, when you had the Mother Mary worship that the Protestants hate so much, you could even look at Protestants breaking away from that as an example of the ascendant, individuated masculine energy doing that. And so you have that type of sort of fundamental force that will appear in different dress anywhere, and it's happening right now, you could say. It's appearing again with Gaia and the Gaian mind. The Gaian mind, as Terence McKenna was happy to talk about immensely. And this is not a trivial thing, because when this energy arises, it's not like I think it's well, it's an interesting thesis to say is it good or bad, but regardless of what it is, it brings along with it, these sort of repetition, routine, intoxication, Dionysian conceptions of the Messiah, the idea of the going down God, the God dismembered through love. It's like that sort of unconsciousness, literally, if you will. And even when the Indo-European comes in, like Odysseus, and stamps his conscious religion, his sky religion, his private property, individuated religion, the religion that can see the difference between things, that can categorize things, that can decide, that can extend over huge periods, the religion of science and all that, when it comes in and it imposes its will upon this lower form, it makes them perhaps the mistake of being dogmatic, because what you see in Odysseus and all that is that it's always there. It's actually it's like man and woman. They must interact, and it must sink into it. And it's almost like man and woman in the sense that, well, sometimes the woman can be the dominant, and sometimes the man can be the dominant. And then, as you're describing in Apollo and Dionysus, you have what you could describe as this clear-headed way of seeing things, literally as Apollonianism. And Apollo is the god of sight. Apollo is the god of hearing, of music, of high culture, high art, articulation, intellect, all these higher things, all these things that are very lucid and stiff. And the way people parody the European, the white man, as like, can't dance, he's stiff, he's makes really weird and obscure old complex classical music and all this type of stuff. And you contrast that with almost the fetishization you see in the Europeans of, like, the brilliant spiritual energy of black people. They have this beautiful hip hop, and it's so rhythmic, and it's so like in the hips, it's so down, it's so groovy and all that, but it doesn't have that sort of articulation that you would see in classical music, but it's got its own thing going. That thing is actually quite similar to what you're saying. It's almost like the chorus, the beat, the Dionysian energy, the rhythmic energy, the body energy, it's actually tied to the sexual energy as well. All these type of things. And so Nietzsche goes with these two things, going from that premise you just said, where you have this sort of division. Nietzsche runs with that and starts to discuss some absolutely fascinating things about our position as Europeans. He's sort of saying, guys, we're about to go into a period where, quote unquote, death of God and all that crack. And he turned out to be very correct. The death of God could be pinned on around about World War I as a serious turning point, considering the thesis we're sort of laying out here. And he's suggesting that that's going to be the death of Apollionism. And that's actually like been a dominant force, an incredibly dominant force. And if we are to, it's interesting, if we were to deal with the problem that's about to come before us, the problem is going to be tied to the fact that we're going to essentially there's going to be such a radical shift that power is going to matter. This is Nietzsche's postmodern thing. So allow me to explain this. Basically, like, we're going to go through a chaos point where we might, our grip of reality might slip out of our hands. You know, the tech will change. So no longer will the horse people have ascendancy. It might go into a sort of fair game where whoever can consolidate power will be the ones who decide what the future brings. And so he was saying that all this like nonsense about philosophizing and idealism and thinking this is how things should be and all this type of stuff, very Apollonian things, you know, intellectual stuff, is going to be incredibly useless, because we're going to go through a period where you're literally going to have to feel your way through it. You know, what do we mean by this? Well, what happens is you're going to be like talking crap about how you're going to perfect science and how you're going to, you know, have a perfect religion or reinvent a new religion and all this stuff. And then World War I is going to come and literally just blow out every, like the huge proportion of your best men. And then you're going to be stuck in a position where you're going to have to sort of roll with the punches and make your way through the next 200 years. And by the time you come out of those next 200 years, like, look at what's happening now. You could come out where there's this giant, everybody's plugged into these like giant nations of essentially hive minds with their own specific internet that's attached to sort of this collective way of thinking. And at that point, like, will there be anything close to Christianity left anymore, or anything, even will there be much of a conception of what the past was left at all? Like, by the time you get out of this thing, it's going to be a whole different game than when you got into it. Consider the difference between the 19th century and even today. Imagine 2100, what it's going to be like. And in order for us as people philosophically to do the correct thing, which is to try make it out in the best position possible, if we focus on this sort of upwards Apollonian way of thinking too excessively, we're going to lose. And so what we need to do is actually sort of face the shadow and become a bit more Dionysian and get down into it. But at the same time, that's going to lead to nihilism. As he said, that's going to lead to the last man. It's going to lead to, you know, the hedonistic consumer who has no higher goals. And so this is where he comes with the thesis of the Übermensch, an Apollonian statement. We need to actually become Dionysian and mix it with Apollonianism, which is, I guess, this other energy as well, almost like what you're describing with Odysseus, and you know, move through these problems. Don't get too like autistic and dogmatic about how things should work, and instead just try and make things work, and then get out the other end in a good position and hopefully lead towards something that's beautiful, great, and ascendant, instead of the very, very scary thing, which is the possibility of a neo-dark age, if you will. So that's, I guess that's sort of how my mind is processing everything.
Yeah, no, I agree with all these images, to be honest, very much in line with my thinking. But what you find in Zarathustra, you know, you have the image of this mountain climber, okay?
Yes.
The idea, for example, you talk correctly about ascending. Okay? Ascending is like a vector, an arrow pointing up somehow. But if God is dead, then where this arrow is pointing to, you know. And what makes, I think, Zarathustra so fascinating, especially the second part, which perhaps not everyone reads, because everyone quotes about the Superman and the Last Man, these two great, you know, the tightrope dancer and everything. But near the end, he has this climb of the mountain that he's trying to get higher and higher. But what's guiding him? What arrow is he following? If that arrow that used to point to God, that was the way to ascend. That's what was the way to become a higher being. Follow that arrow up to God. If God is dead, then where is this arrow pointing to? And yet he dares to continue climbing. That's what makes him such a great character.
Interesting. Oh shit, that's such a good take. That's
So,
such a...
so back to the birth of tragedy, another image to see these two consciousness, Dionysiac and Apollonian. You can think of the Matrix, that proverbial special effects of the Matrix where, everything turns into zeros and ones, green for some reason, old computer metaphor, green zeros and ones. That to a certain degree, is what modern physicists tell us that the nature of matter is, everything. There's no clear distinction between objects. I look at my computer screen, the air around it. So I'm told that if I were to zoom in exactly where the screen ends and the air begins, I wouldn't see that big border that I see with my eyes. I'd see energy particles essentially dancing around Dionysiac style into other, the difference between my skin and my clothes, so to speak, is not that between lead and gold, is that between the waltz and the tango. It's the way these particles that make our reality move, So it's almost like if you were to look at a big, public ball with a drone, we would say today, where right at the center, people are dancing the tango very clearly and very correctly. And then at the edge, people are dancing the waltz very correctly. And yet in between these two extremes, you have a gradient where people are dancing mostly tango, but a little bit of valse, then mostly valse, then a little bit different. That's apparently how our reality is, our physical material reality. Okay, but if you take that zeros and ones and you snap out of it, you go back into how we perceive it, you might see, the image of a tiger eating a gazelle. Between the tiger and the gazelle, there's this gentle gradient of energy, of more energy particles, wave particles dancing from the mouth of the tiger to the choking neck of the gazelle. It's all beautiful, nothing's going on. But if you take a step back, it's life and death.
Yeah.
So that's another way to think of these two principles. Is that actor, that one who got away from the dance, from the circular dance of Dionysus, stepped into it and said, wait, I'm going to die. There was a moment in my life, I think I was 5 years old, when I learned that I was going to die. I've talked about it with friends. Most can relate. They remember the moment they learned they were going to die.
That's such a brilliant take. Holy shit. So it's yeah.
That's begging the question, what exactly did we think before? So obviously before this age, we're in this ever dancing, ever Dionysiac energy. We're here, we might be somewhere else, we might be, but death, this line, that's it. Some, the end. You learn it, and that's very Apollonian, cutting that Dionysiac dancing, So Nietzsche had this idea, and that's one more metaphor, and a metaphor that he gives in the book is through arts, music, especially that hip-hop, drum beating, pipe-like pneumatic music was very Dionysiac, because everything gets blended in, one sound gets blended into another. The tango blends with the waltz, the light particles get blended with my body. And then logos, the spoken word, let's say for simplicity's sake, although it's more than that, logos was Apollonian. So logos and music, that was the tragedy. And it's often forgotten that the ancient Greek tragic playwrights were not playwrights in the modern sense. They didn't just write the play, they wrote the music as well. All the Greek tragic playwrights, they wrote what the actor said and the music. They were like complete artists.
Yeah.
It was only then they were considered playwrights or poets.
when you say that, that's actually interesting, because the vision I've been having in my head, for the purpose of my life, I think, is to achieve something along those lines. Is to actually kind of get that, because I don't like just telling stories, and writing them down, because they're very dry. And I find that even reading stories is, it sparks my imagination, certainly, but I don't think it's quite as powerful as listening to them, because then the person can kind of like, if they do a good job telling a story, they can sort of paint a lot better of a picture in your mind. It doesn't require the same focus reading does. And second of all, the cadence in your voice. And then obviously, if you mix that with music, you have an incredible power
Yeah.
that's going in. So that's been something I've been subtly thinking about a lot, is about the perfect art. Sorry if there's
Yeah,
a
I
big
mean, I'm right there myself, to be honest. I was thinking about it the other, I'm more inclined to the visual art, but I know that, my main focus, my main gift, if I can call it, has to do with the spoken word or the written word or the word in general. But I don't feel that is complete. I think very much in images and in kind of complete scenes,
Yeah.
where the visuals are almost as important as the
And
words. And it's very hard to it's very hard to bring that out in anyone's life, but it's very interesting to know that there were these people that did do everything. And
yeah,
when
the ancient Irish bards were the same. It was the same kind of thing. Actually, I've a couple of thoughts on that, by the way. So one of them that I'll just throw out there first is that, and then maybe the next one will be a good one to sort of close on as well. So the first one was that, that thing you were describing about, you could get in the Dionysian way of seeing the reality, and then you could like go towards a gazelle and the lion and see it as this like waltz and tango interplay between the particles, and get all absorbed in it, and sort of be like, like, oh, it's so beautiful and all that. And then you'd zoom out and see that it's like, oh fuck, I'm getting eaten alive. And that's actually fascinating, because in that sense, you could take the same attitude towards art. It's actually a lot like what you seem to have done very well with all this stuff. A lot of people just see art as this sort of like, oh, cool art. And it's all pretty and all this stuff. And you get kind of caught up in it, and it's like amazing. And then when you actually read into it, you realize that like Merlin putting this whole crowd of people into a trance on top of a ziggurat while Conan the Barbarian comes up might actually be you getting a crystal clear vision of like the fact that you're probably getting entranced by Merlin or something like that. Maybe the Apollyon mind actually kind of snapped you out of something there a little bit, which is absolutely a fascinating thing if you draw it to some of its conclusions. Like, why are films like The Matrix even showing up at all in our consciousness? There's a very, very good question. And it's like dream reading, you can just dream, and Jung says you'll individuate quite slowly and naturally, but if you bring the Apollyon mind into it, like you can jog the process a little bit. And then I guess that kind of ties to something else I've noticed. I actually brought this up just briefly, and it's a very interesting problem where the European people have essentially fallen into a state of lack of grace, if you will. And what do I mean by that? They see what you could call their art as stiff, old, and boring. Even rock music, they see it as like not that interesting anymore. Whereas we look at like we look at African music and all that as this vibrant and energetic and powerful stuff, and it is. I actually really, really like it. But it's that sort of problem where it's like, there's nothing coming out of me anymore. There's no creativity coming out of me. So I'm going to go over there, and I'm going to find meaning in that, and I'm going to adapt my identity to that. So much so that I've met guys in Dublin, and they dress it with like baseball caps, big long baggy clothes, big hoodies, and they walk around being like, "Yo, bro, what's up, man? What's up?" They have big chains. It's like they're stuck in the 80s, and they're like, looking for KRS-One or something like that.
Another cultural reference for whoever's following the UFC is Khabib Nurmagomedov. Whoever doesn't, he's a very top UFC fighter, wrestler from this Islamic place in the ex-Soviet Union, Dagestan, Republic, is Islamic Republic, and he is, he would have been the prime character to turn into a villain. Okay, for whoever knows his 80s, you had Rocky versus Draco, the big Russian Soviet man, you know, perfect man, never smile, square jaw, blonde, short hair. He even took steroids, you know, this is like an engineered man. He does not break. He said, I'm going to break you. And Khabib could be portrayed as a version of that. He's Russian. He does say, I'm going to break you. I'm going to smash you. He does speak a bit like Draco. And he's Muslim, a devout Muslim at that. So whatever he lost as a Russian after the collapse of the Soviet Union, as a villain, he should have gained as a Muslim. Yet, he is not the villain. He is the hero of our story. Even I see him as a hero, you know, to be honest. And then you have Conor McGregor, you know, from your neck of the woods, who should have been the hero. He should have represented this, you know, primal soul that is in Americans. The Irish, you know, should have been a symbol of this primal America coming in, you know, but he's not. He's almost turned into a villain in the collective mind of Americans. It's an amazing turn of events.
Yeah, and that's actually like a really, really good point to point out, is that it is actually like almost like a declaration of the crisis. Conor was sunk. He was loved here, and now he's actually subtly hated. Although I still love him, Conor. If you're listening, like I love you. If Conor made it through this, I'm sure he would. He has the type of mind that he just get into the weirdest stuff, I'd imagine. So you never know. He might be right at the end of this. But anyway, he kind of sank into the archetype of our age, which is the sort of Instagram, you know, holding up a stack of money by his ear and all this type of stuff. And he's like the representative of the peak libido power of the West. It's and literally like the Atlantic West. Think of it this way. He is like the Anglosphere archetype of the ideal, the way every man wants to be. Rock star athlete, you know, talks the talk, has all the money and all that stuff. And what's so amazing about what happened with Khabib is that whole thing got exposed as hedonistic, baseless, materialistic, empty, all talk, no action. Whereas Khabib comes in with this almost like humble Muslim energy. And I remember seeing this in the comments and stuff like that. And people were being like, you know, this is the righteousness for Allah to crush the degenerate European. And this is actually something I referenced earlier. Like it is actually that type of energy. And if you think of it from a Muslim perspective, and this is what's interesting about it, it's not like the Muslims being like, yeah, we smashed you, this is a race war or something like that. But a lot of Europeans kind of looked towards this and kind of said, yeah, Conor was a bit of an embarrassment with that. And, exactly. But, you know, like a lot of Anglos and Atlanticists and like the Irish.
To Khabib's eyes.
Yeah, yeah. Like we actually saw the noble figure and it wasn't him. And it's a frightening thing.
Yeah.
And even to kind of cycle that back to the music thing as well, like there is this hollowness in everything, in that like Europeans are, you know, they're all trying to be like black people. They're all trying to fetishize rap. Like even like I'd love to say I'm above it, man, but you go on my fucking channel and I've got like a couple of rap songs up, and it's like I think I do an all right job of not trying to be a black person, but it's still at the same time you can see what's going on.
About Khabib, you know, I see him as a hero.
Yeah, yeah. And what you're just bringing up there, which is an interesting one, because I hear a lot of people talk about the problem that we like need. There's actually another dynamic to this too, which is almost like the mass democratic of capitalism, which is actually a feature in this problem with Conor and this problem with Europeans' lack of soul and all that. And blended with that is also the problem of high art has died. And so art is now reduced to 4-minute songs, like Instagram photos. And there's nothing more ascendant than that. Like that's all it is. It's as consumable as possible. And when me and you talk, you know, when you start to describe to me, like I do sort of see these visions of these more complete artists and all that, I have those too. And I wonder that, like, because I would consider yourself and myself to be someone who's honestly digging into this stuff and maybe, you know, finding the vitality still down there and something genuinely original, an origin point for something new. I'd wonder if, like in a very Jungian sense, I wonder if we tap into this and we start to produce out of it almost the way hip hop worked. You know, they were stuck in their ghettos, but they started to produce out of themselves their own libido energy. And it's now carried a couple of the people who were part part of the movement to billionaire status. I wonder, are we in sort of a similar position where we're sort of getting the vision of the new art, getting the vision of the how to be Conan versus Merlin and these type of things, and maybe if we follow it, or if some boyos hear this and they actually take it on board and carry it forward, you'd start to get the authentic redeeming power that would pull us away from, you know, the Conor McGregorism, or like all of us trying to be like middle class gangsters and all this type of stuff.
Yeah, you know, I'm going to tell you something, because you just reminded me. I'm usually very good at keeping a log, okay, of my own ideas, because I know ideas, they're like, you know, if you don't grab them and put them on paper, they're gone. So I've learned this, and I'm old. But there's one idea. I'm going to say it here just so that it's recorded, so people will know it's mine. But you just reminded me this. It's amazing. I had this, well, I wouldn't glorify it into a vision of the Jungian, but, you know, as an artist, I kind of saw it in London, a kind of alternative story, kind of turning the story. I kind of imagined a world like it's portrayed in Houellebecq's Submission. Whoever's read this book, it's a future Europe that's become Muslim, it's become Islamic. But he doesn't go very far. He just describes the very early stages. But so, you know, I imagine if you go far and you have this white European culture becoming the underculture, and going back, and I wanted to write a story where they went back to medieval troubadour style poetry.
Yeah.
The troubadours, of course, being something of the inventors of love. You know,
yes,
you see love in sharp decline. I mean, if anything, you think that love, as in falling in love, you know, it's free. I mean, you can understand, well, you can kind of understand why the economy is not doing well. Why, a few things, but still people should be able to fall in love like they used to, but they don't exactly, or they don't talk about it. If you watch films or series, you know, they used to be about these very strong love stories, which were predicated in a very strong male-female dynamic, you know, like even things like 9.5 Weeks, you know, which was not the most magnificent film ever produced. But you have this scene where Mickey Rourke seduces Kim Basinger, and they're almost dancing like swans are dancing at a lake, where he puts himself in her vision and she turns away almost shy, and he turns his head, and there's this incredible, which you just can't see it now.
Yeah.
You can't see it now. Instead, most of the heroes you find in films and series are essentially psychopaths. You know, Breaking Bad, Dexter, what was the
fuck, that's actually such a bleak truth, man. Holy shit.
Even Sherlock Holmes, you know, he said, I'm not a psychopath, I'm a highly functioning sociopath. You know,
true detective. Like, they're almost like the, you know, I love our artists. Like, I was literally, like, I've talked to loads of them, they're the best ever, but you sort of see them as like these almost autistic magicians, as you're describing, in some sense. That's the archetype, and there's no love. Like, this is machine men.
Yeah. And there's a brilliant film that captured this. Damn, I can't remember the name. Jake Gyllenhaal, I think, is the actor, where he plays this young sociopathic guy who wants to succeed, but he wants to succeed, you know, on the line of all these success gurus tell you, you know, that cult. He's part of that cult of success, and he's this autistic. I think I gave enough, but to look it up, whoever. But going back, to the culture, I think just to close this huge tangent of, there is something. You just reminded me of a few things I had forgotten. But there is something in seeing our culture as a marginalized culture, not as a dominant culture. There is something there for artists today.
Yeah, because that's true. Because you know, I think the one thing, like, the political stuff can be kind of a bit of a headache, because it's it's like this, for example, I consider interesting, but you're not going to hear about this in the kind of like on Twitter or anything like that, or maybe certain corners you would, but not too much. But one thing you will notice is that there's one dominant thing about what we call the left, and they have the dominant thing is that they sort of feel like they're fighting against the system, and they sort of describe themselves as like these rebels representing this counterculture. And you know, like that's definitely not true. Like this is definitely not true. They're in like a hegemonic position. And what I start to notice now is that you meet a lot of people who are apolitical. Like they really don't give a fuck. They'd actually probably would be liberal left wingers 50 years ago, but you talk to them and they're actually, and it's not even like they're political. They're just craving something that is authentically, you know, the underdog. They're craving that. And they start to drift towards sort of some of the ideas that we're talking about here. And some of these would be perceived as right wing, but like that's, again, trying to stamp a category on something that is just not categorizable like that at all. But again, that's the sort of point we're getting at, is that it does seem like there's a vibrant energy in what you're just describing that's sort of been marginalized by perhaps the great Minoan culture or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing about left wing and right wing. I don't consider it right wing myself. Yeah. What I think is that what we call the right wing today is that patch of our garden that we left unattended. So wildflowers bloom, so to speak.
Yes.
The left and the center left and the center and perhaps part of the center right, or the libertarian right, you know, the conservative, the Christian right, all these were cultivated fully through art, through literature, through, you know, through those bits. But there was a space where there was left unattended. So new things came out. It's almost like you have a garden and you leave literally a patch unattended and you find whatever wild roses, to give a poetic image there. So you might conclude that these flowers like the shade because that's just where this patch happened to be. No, perhaps they just don't like being mown down every week. Perhaps if you weren't doing that in the rest of the garden, there would have been, you know, original ideas being those flowers. The reason that you find these original ideas in the so-called right today is because that is the place that was not
sheared off.
You know, they're not necessarily right way. If you can find them in Plato, if you can find them in Aristotle, if you can find them in ancient religions, they're not right wing, not the way we understand it, at least. That I want to put this out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, like, even to extend your metaphor there, it's like the political shears will take, you know, they'll look at the Christian base in America and they'll try shear it into a sort of, these guys have a sort of unified identity that supports the GOP. And then the people who are like, you know, the atheist liberals who are, I guess you could say that this sort of more closer to what we understand as the Minoans, they get sheared into a political stock, a political flock of cattle that vote a certain way and all this type of stuff. And as you're saying, these things get shaped and cultivated, and with the power of super industry, these people's identities get crafted by this machine. But there are all these fringes and all these little places that pop up that are just beyond categorization because they're just vibrant and alive. And you can stamp whatever label you want on them, but it's more, the question is more about, are they real or not? And this is like, just to give you compliments, like this conversation that you just have, I think is one of the, like, this thread of thought fully developed is nuclear power. Like, it's so good because I think it seems true.
I believe that many novels and poems and films and can be written. It's not guaranteed. There's a lot of nourishment in these ideas for your young artists to explore. You know, they just have to take that red pill, I guess, for lack of a better metaphor, you know, after that. And just to kind of, before we kind of ran out of time, just to almost finish off this, well, it's become a tangent now about the birth of tragedy. It's very, very interesting how Nietzsche chooses to close his work. Okay, so the first part, he explores these two principles, the Dionysiac, which we identified perhaps with that pre-Minoan, through that legend of Semele and Zeus, and Apollonian ascending, you know, pure, clear clarity of vision, clarity of mind, almost numeric quality to it. Nietzsche was one of the first, to my knowledge, to look at Socrates, famous father of philosophy, in a darker light.
Yeah.
Socrates has this place in history. He's almost like Jesus, essentially. He's actually being parallelized to Jesus. Parallels have been drawn. First, because Socrates wrote nothing. We know most of what we know from Plato, Plato being the kind of St. Paul of Socrates. Socrates also died, executed, not in his prime, in his old age, but nonetheless, he died executed, still hanging on, believing to his ideas. So there's these parallels, but beyond them, Socrates was almost deified. You know, he was beyond a man. And Nietzsche was one of the first to kind of see a darker aspect. Not to Socrates necessarily the man. He didn't say, oh, Socrates did all these bad things we don't know about. No. What Socrates brought, okay, which was this rationalization of the world. What Socrates gave was a tool with which you could doubt everything. Okay, everything. Religion, tradition, traditional, today we'd say traditional gender roles, the concept of genders, everything. He gave a tool, this dialectic, this rational, that he could doubt. You know, in traditional societies, knowledge was not for everyone. That's an aspect of traditional societies that we either forget or turn into conspiracy theories. You know, the mysteries of the pyramids. You know, people every, I'm not going to swear at anybody, but every, you know, things they're going to discover an ancient book hidden in the pyramids, they're going to read it and they're going to learn everything. You know, no. Knowledge was hierarchical. And there are these fragments. There's a few schools in philosophy that have tried to revive this notion. There is a book called The Lost Art of Esoteric Writing, I think. Esoteric in this case doesn't mean mystical, religious. It just, this person, he's following the tradition of Leo Strauss, was the man who brought this notion back, kind of said there's a dimension on ancient cultures and on ancient texts that we forgot, which is that they weren't written for the masses. They were written for a few in the language of the masses. Yes. So Leo Strauss obviously lived, you know, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, so already this radical egalitarianism was there. So his ideas were not very well taken, but some of his students went on to, and there's this book from, there's this.
That's the Minoans calling, man. They're
yeah,
like, what the fuck you telling them about my secret knowledge, bro? Like, that's what they're saying.
Actually, you perhaps are not too far, but can you speak right? Yes.
What's wrong, sir? Do you want me to? Are you stuck for time, or what's going on?
Yeah, no. Can you see me all right? Or?
Oh yeah, everything's perfect. Yeah,
cool.
You're good.
So, okay, so this book, The Lost Art of Esoteric Writing, actually gathers proof from ancient texts that shows you that that's not just an idea that Leo Strauss had, that's actually what Plato thought. That's actually what most ancient writers thought, that you have to speak in a way that what you intend is going to be understood by the few only. And the idea, and he goes in, it's almost like this book is dedicated to prove this point, you know, and as you read it, you go, yeah, there's all these writers who've said that. You know, just to give you an example, in one of Plato's dialogues, Protagoras, Protagoras talks with Socrates, and Protagoras is a sophist, is a philosopher in his own right, and Socrates kind of examines what Protagoras knows. You know, they're in this great intellectual debate. So Protagoras says, I'm going to tell you about myself, Socrates. First of all, he said, I'm one of the very few philosophers who are not hiding. He said, as we say, many wise men hide their wisdom because they're afraid of its consequences. Namely, he says, Homer, he says, everyone believes he was a poet, but he was not. He was a philosopher disguising as a poet.
Yes.
And that's actually in the text. So there is this idea. So Socrates is the man, according to Nietzsche, who breaks this tradition. He throws it in the garbage. And he gives a method by which everyone can doubt about everything. Okay, so the result is that the whole culture of Athens, according to Nietzsche, changes into, again, we can draw a parallel with the 1960s and what came after. It became a kind of more egalitarian, more liberal kind of slave. You know, in one of Plato's works, Socrates famously has a slave, uneducated slave, derived Pythagoras' theorem. Okay, so that was the quantum physics of its time, I guess, you know, and a slave was, you know, the least educated. And he derives it, Socrates guides him to that knowledge through questions. So proving that even that slave boy had this knowledge of Pythagoras was in this uneducated slave. Okay, he just needed someone to take it out of him. Okay, and that was Socrates' method, the method to take knowledge out of anyone, because apparently everyone has the same knowledge. There's no higher and lower anymore. There's no wise man and ignorant, you know. So this cultural change brings the end of tragedy, according to Nietzsche. This tragedy was based on this interplay between the Apollonian actor who knows the lion is eating the gazelle, in our previous example, and the chorus, the dance, the ever-flowing energy. This was the original inception. As Socrates changes that culture, Euripides is the last great tragic playwright, comes in and changes tragedy to match the changing times, the changing liberal, egalitarian culture that sprang out of Socrates' intervention. And Euripides' tragedies, you don't have the actors talking with a chorus as much. You have the actors talking among themselves in a kind of almost as if they can solve the problems of existence between them. They don't have this confrontation with the ebb and flow of cosmic energies anymore. They're talking like we're talking, trying to resolve all these things in front of the audiences. Okay, Euripides is a success. Famously, he gives roles to women, he gives roles to slaves, he gives roles to, he changes the language of the ancient tragedies was very close to Homer, was this almost poetic idiom that no one talked daily, but everyone understood. And he changes that into the language of the people. So he turns tragedy into a soap opera in a way. And he's a big success. But and actually,
it's almost like the ascension of Netflix, if you know what I mean.
Yes,
like it moved away from operatic Wagner-like, you know, narrative, which is almost like mytho-poetry in the way it presents itself, to films, which are still absolutely gorgeous and amazing, like Stanley Kubrick and all that.
Exactly.
Until you've essentially got Netflix now, which is like it's binge watching, and people actually say that, you know, Netflix is not as good as films, but they can't stop watching it. You know, they're addicted to it, and it's mass produced. Yeah,
exactly. And Nietzsche, very, very timely in my understanding, saw that this was not necessarily the director or the playwright being closer to the people. He said the playwright Euripides, in this case, or Aeschylus, always knew he was above the people. But by showing them their own reflection, he's almost even more of an egoist, because he's robbing them of that ascending potential. He's just reflecting their image
That's
back then.
such
So
a
it's
good
almost
idea.
like, he is the great mind, he knows that, but he doesn't have other great minds or great heroes on stage. Now he has normal, common people. So
I know there's a lot of Christian boyos, so I don't want to offend anybody too much, but I have, like, the dark thoughts about Christianity, and the Nietzsche presents is that Christianity may have actually functioned a lot like the way you're describing, where
yeah,
it's sort of like you get this character who is the fallen lower man, if you will, and he gets horrifically ashamed and all this, and so he gets projected back on top of him. And you had someone like Julian the Apostate, who tried to invoke paganism in Rome and bring it back after Constantine decided he'd let it in and Christianity in. He tried to bring it back, and he fought and he fought and he fought, and he just couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. And at the end of his life, he confessed. He said, the people want Christianity, and there will be no way to control them without it. Paganism is practically useless,
yeah,
and so it obscured into this, as you're saying, this elite thing, and Christianity, and even, dare I say it, and this is a dark blasphemy, so forgive me. The image of Christ is like something that you should put on the ceiling of their reality, so that you can conduct yourself without having to deal with
yeah,
them at all,
yeah.
with their concession. Think of what the divine right of kings of the Catholics meant, is that those guys are allowed to rule without your interference, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Scary thoughts.
There's a wonderful film, Agora, that portrays this transition very, very well. Whoever hasn't seen it, Rachel Weisz, she the Greek philosopher, and one of her slaves becomes one of the first Christians. Very beautifully written, directed, acted, and obviously takes a position against the Christians, at least in that historical context. But he gives them a good. It's not how Christians would portray themselves, but it's not slander. It's not propaganda.
Mm-hmm,
It's,
mm-hmm.
And they have their moments. They have the beautiful moments as well. So whoever wants an image. But to finish off that great, kind of book, scratching on the surface, of course, from that point when Nietzsche kind of puts Socrates to the stand, it essentially says they were right. They were right to execute you. You were guilty.
Yeah, I've read this actually.
Corrupt the youth, and on that pedestal, you could stand Sartre, you could stand the existentialists, you could start
Deconstructionism, yeah, critical
deconstruction,
theory,
you
yeah,
could
it's all the
stand
same thing in some sense.
Slavoj Žižek, you could stand and say, you did corrupt the young, didn't you?
Yeah.
Who would have thought after all
And
these years?
there's this really interesting take on this that if I don't say so myself, because I'm about to present it, but if you take this thesis, all right, about Socrates is like the rationalizing mind, it's actually quite similar to the idea of the rising of the magician. And what happens is that this is a very Nietzschean statement, that like what happens after a long period of domestication through civilization, and that's often just a process. It's not like a conspiracy or anything like that. Everybody gets boxed into cities, everybody wears togas, they get wealthy, they stop working as much, and so their physiology begins to decay. And then what happens is they lose touch with their instincts sort of die out of them, and so they become more, quote unquote, effeminized. They become the proverbial soy boy, if you will. And what happens then is that they can't really inject their masculinity into the world through the old way, which was through essentially force and creative force. I don't mean in this sort of blunt negative force, but in the sort of shaping power of the hand of man. Instead, what they start to do is they start to project it in the only way that's really, really appropriate anymore, which is through the mind, which is through reasoning. And so this is where you start to get the sort of castrated Socrates type character.
Yeah.
And Socrates wasn't even this person. He's more the archetype. Socrates is actually like an athlete, apparently.
Exactly.
But he's sort of starting to represent this thinking man, this reasoning man. And actually in the negative sense, you think of it like the scientist, the tech head, who's really, really talented and smart and can do all these amazing things, but he's like frightened out of his mind to talk to girls because he has no Dionysian feeling. And actually you think about modern European culture, you have the whites, and this is very, very broad strokes, is sort of like the stiff tech guys who, you know, or do all this stuff and make all this stuff and put all this stuff into order and all this stuff, and all these universities, and they're like building these machines and all this. And then they look at, like, as I said, the Africans as the people who do the sports, as the people who do the music, as people who do the more alive things. They're almost disembodied and detached from that type of thing. And Nietzsche would point to this as like the death of an instinct. He's trying to say that, like, all right, you get so caught up in his fucking words because you're an idiot. But actually, if you just look at the big picture, what's going on here, it's almost like the Greeks lost their instinct. Their assertive instincts died off. And this was their point where they're going to sink back into the Minoan mindset.
Exactly.
And Socrates was like the guiding, the Morpheus, to actually bring them back into the matrix, if you will, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
And that actually ties a huge amount into some of the things that are happening to us, if you think about it.
Absolutely.
Like a lot of what we're describing and what Nietzsche was saying, that we needed more Dionysian energy, is tied to the idea that we don't have any instincts. First of all, actually, we mentally don't trust our instincts. And second of all, our instincts aren't loud enough inside of ourselves that we have to obey them. You know what I mean? Whereas you can imagine these people we fetishize, these Africans, like they're after coming out of an intense amount of struggle and, like, you know, nature, and they want to win. They haven't won the way that Europeans have. They want to win. They want to ascend. They just have that drive inside of them. And so we fetishize that because we can't find it in ourselves. And a lot of what we're talking about this idea of redeeming our culture in some sense would be about shedding off all resentment or projection and all this, and actually say, all right, where's our will inside of us, as Nietzsche would say? Where's our Dionysian drive? And attached to that, let it speak. And as we've described, this is the sort of dark patch in the corner that's actually extremely fertile and extremely interesting. So
yeah, and to finish that tangent off, you know, the book itself,
and please could we wrap it up with this, because I got a call like about 40 minutes ago. This has been great though.
Wrapping it. So the book itself, Birth of Tragedy, finish off with an exaltation of Richard Wagner, who's like Aeschylus. It's exactly what Germany needs, etc. Nietzsche will then fall out to a certain degree with Wagner, and that's kind. But in the history of tragedy, the last tragic play is Euripides' Baghae. Okay, it's not the last tragic play, full stop, that's ever been written, but it's the last play of the three great tragic playwrights. Okay, so it's the last notable word of that era. In that play, Dionysus returns from the east, and there's a beautiful opening where Dionysus proclaims himself as a god coming from the east. And he named all the places. He said, I passed the Bactrian walls and the sun-scorched land of the Persians, and came to this Greek city first, Thebes, which is the archetype city of Greek tragedy. He said, after I set all these lands on fire through my wild, ecstatic dances. So, I mean, my job is done there. And he comes to Greece, he said, in anger, because he says, I demand to be worshipped again. Okay. That legend we talked about, Zeus and Semele, in that play, Dionysus claims that the people of Thebes, the Greeks now, had corrupted the myth. And they said that Semele did not sleep with a god, but with a man. So she was a whore. And the Dionysus was not a god as a consequence. You know, he's not worshipped, and he demands to be worshipped. So he drives the women of Thebes to madness. They go off the mountains, they sing, they dance, they're ecstatic. There's no more women in the city anymore. King Panthus comes to the stage, he represents authority. You know, that would be de Gaulle in May 1968. Okay, the women, hippies, you know, imagination to power. And de Gaulle is like, what's going on? And Dionysus comes to Panthus, the king, says, you must worship me. Panthus denies, Dionysus warns him, he denies again, and then he tricks him, almost in a Freudian sense. He said, Dionysus says, don't you want to come with me to see the women dancing naked? Your own mother is one of them. He goes, And he says, I'll come. And then he has him dressed as a woman, transgender, because he says you need to disguise yourself as woman because these are female mysteries, Minoan great mother earth worshipping. He dresses a woman, takes them to the mountains. It's a trap. Dionysus shouts at the women, uncovers a man present. They fall on him and tear him apart. And his own mother cuts his head off, thinking she caught a wild lion. She comes down to the city of Thebes, meets her father, the grandfather of the slaved king, with his head on her hand, on her lap. He says, "Father, look what I brought you, your trophy, a lion. I killed a lion." The grandfather is horrified. He says, "Look at the sun, the sky principle. Look at the sky," he says. She looks at the sky, her Dionysiac ecstasy goes away, and then she looks down into the head she's carrying, and then everything falls down. She realizes she had killed her son. The kingdom has fallen. And there's a very, very strange and interesting, and I'm not going to comment it. I know I speak to like-minded people, but I'm still not going to comment it. At the end of the play, which was a mystery even for classicists, Dionysus says, destroys the whole city, everything's done, the Maenads, the Bacchae have wreaked their havoc, they've sung, they've danced, they ripped the men apart, it's done, it's over. And then Dionysus says, turns to the grandfather, who has lost his kingdom now, and to the mother, who has killed her own son, says, "And now I'm exiling you. You shall go to the east, from which you will return at the head of a giant army of Asians, with which you will overrun Europe."
Shit, what?
That's a good point. And they even wonder. I think one of the last lines is they say, "But why? Why? How are we ever going to do this? Why would we ever do this?" You know?
Oh my God, that is so fucking crazy. Holy shit. I guess there's one of those things that we'll just leave that down to the audience.
Yeah.
We'll just leave it down. Dearest unwashed boyos, unwashed masses out there, if you've any thoughts, maybe actually, I don't know, would writing your thoughts on YouTube about that be a good idea, but that's an amazing ending to that story. It's also like, I guess since we're fucked anyway, just one little note on that is, oh my God, no, I can't. No, I have to stop it. I'm sorry. I'll go on for another hour, man. It's too good. It's too good. Here, look, we'll end it on that. That's a good enough end, though. Thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you. That
was 10 out of 10. That was absolutely brilliant, people. I really learned a lot. I can't wait to talk about this stuff more. But before we do any of that stuff, head over to Ancient Greece Revisited. I will leave links in description, links in the top comment. Absolutely world-class stuff here. That was absolutely fascinating. Give this guy a bit of a boost. Give him some juice, boyos. Give him some Dionysian energy, and give him stuff that's going on. I definitely look forward to working with yourself more in future, sir. And that was it's good. It's good to talk to a Greek who knows Greek mythology. That's the stuff. So
yes.
All right, fantastic, gents, fantastic. Thank you, sir. And I guess I'll wrap it up there. If you have any last words, you can drop them to the boyos, the Dionysian mob.
No, I think it's a perfect place to wrap it up.
Fantastic, brother. Thank you, and I'll talk to you later. Bye, people. Bye.